Tonight, you're not just scrolling past another old story. You're standing in a Roman courtyard where marble remembers everything and is about to be taught how to forget. Before you fall asleep, you'll watch a name get voted out of time. You'll learn the quiet toolkit. Rome used to turn people into that man, and you'll see how the smallest blank space, one missing plaque, one shaved jawline, can tell a louder truth than any statue ever did. Hammer ticks on marble. Wax warms beneath a stylus. Afternoon light turns a carved name into dust. Something nearby keeps time a patient, little tap tap tap, slow and obedient. And if your breathing starts to follow it, that's perfect. Inhale 4. Exhale 6. If nights like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share where and what time you're listening from, maybe that tiny marble tick will remember you there. Because tonight's story doesn't begin with a battle or a crown falling. It begins with a vote, and a chisel being handed a set of instructions. You might not expect a government to treat a person like a spelling mistake, but Rome, practical as a ledger and just as moody, sometimes decided a name needed to be edited out. Not shouted down, not argued with at dinner, just removed. Like a wax seal warmed too long and pressed flat again, as if nothing had ever been stamped there in the first place. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the air do what it does. Somewhere in imagined courtyard, a hammer ticks on marble with the patience of a small metronome, and a stylus warms wax until it becomes cooperative. A name spoken once in public can thin to dust in afternoon light. Rome's version of forgetting could start with a vote, which is a very tidy way to begin a mess. The Senate lifts hands, a formula is spoken, and a life once loud in forums, once printed on coins, once carved into stone gets converted into instructions, not a funeral. Not even a dramatic condemnation with good acoustics, more like administrative subtraction. Images to be removed, honors to be canceled. Offerings to stop. The city learns a new law for pretending it never looked. Breathe in 4, out 6. The decision is made in a room that smells faintly of ink, old wool, and the kind of confidence only paperwork can produce. And then, because Rome loved making decisions feel real, the chisel arrives. Stonecutters were not philosophers, but they did become, briefly, experts in public denial. A name on an arch is not just letters. It's a claim you can trip over for centuries. So a worker climbs up with a mallet and begins to undo what another worker once did with pride. Letter by letter, the groove becomes a scar. Sometimes the face is left and the name goes. Sometimes the name stays, but the titles are shaved down until the inscription sounds politely vague, like a resume edited for safety. It is strange to watch a city spend money to make itself less certain. There's a quiet humor in how official it all looks. Clerks copy penalties in neat lines, so anger can travel by courier, and the result is a kind of calm cruelty. A document will say, in careful Latin, that statues must come down and dedications must be revised. It reads less like rage and more like a maintenance request. If you are still awake by the time we get to the part where someone is instructed to relabel a milestone, you can subscribe, or don't. Rome would understand. Rome was very good at not noticing people. Once the decree exists, the unnaming begins, and it is strangely domestic. Triumphal arches lose their captions. Altars forget who paid for them. Milestones shed sponsors like a snake shedding a skin it never liked. A name can be removed from a public thing, but the public thing remains stubbornly there, taking up space and casting shade, acting innocent. Stonecutters sometimes plug letters with mortar and then plane the surface so the text looks clean again. The repair leaves a neat rectangle, silent as policy. A patch of smoothness in the middle of a sentence, like someone replaced a word with a blank and expected the marble to be discreet about it. Maps stay the same, the legend changes. Streets rehearse the revision overnight. People still walk past the same arch, still buy bread near the same temple steps, but now they do it under a slightly edited memory. The city does not move, but the story slides sideways. It's a little like renaming a group chat and pretending the old messages were always about something else. Except here the chat is an empire and the messages are carved into stone. Now, if we drift from stone to smaller things you can hold in your hand, Rome becomes even more efficient. Faces can be recut, coins can be recalled. Portraits are shaved into new emperors, hair altered, jaw reweighted, eyes taught to be someone else. You can almost picture a sculptor squinting and thinking, very calmly, if I adjust the chin a bit, this tyrant becomes a respectable successor. Bronze heads vanish into furnaces. Silver denarii come home through taxes and never return. It's monetary laundry, but the kind where the washing machine is a fire and the detergent is politics. Coins are especially intimate because they are history you can buy an onion with. When a face is removed from currency, it's not just symbolism. It's logistics. Old coins get hoarded, melted, overstruck, or quietly pushed out of circulation until the market forgets what it used to accept. There's something sleepily absurd about the phrase coin recall, as if Rome sent out a gentle announcement, please return all previous versions of the emperor. The budget reads repairs, the gallery reads amnesia, the crowd reads whatever is still hanging. And there are the private tools, the softer ones, paper, wax, whisper, papyrus is scraped and overwritten. Wax tablets are leveled smooth as if no message ever pressed them. Public records strike lines through titles. Private letters switch to pronouns and ellipses. A man becomes that man. A name becomes he, and the he becomes was. It's not that people forget how to speak. They just learn, quietly, what is safe to say in certain rooms. If you listen carefully, you can hear language putting on its shoes and walking a different route home. Rome kept records of everything and also developed a talent for filing. Chroniclers, when they had to be careful, could type awkward reigns under weather or prodigies. A comet appears. A statue weeps. An ox does something rude in a sacred space. Meanwhile, an emperor conveniently becomes background noise. It is a gentle trick. The safest way to erase a person is not always to chisel them out, but to place them behind something mildly distracting, like a strange birthmark on the moon or an unusually stubborn drought. If we keep moving outward, away from public monuments and into houses, the erasure becomes collateral silence. Statues and atriums step down. Household gods, the little Larrys that receive daily offerings, accept quieter gifts. Family seals are boxed and sealed again. Heirs trade cognomina or adopt new patrons so their signatures can keep earning. Freedmen pick new masters on paper. Old favors are paid in distance, not thanks. Confiscations arrive with receipts because Rome loved making even theft look like accounting. Absence is made legible so it can be enforced, like a blank space with a stamp next to it. Imagine being a nephew who has practiced saying a certain name your whole life, and now you must pretend your mouth never learned it. Imagine a household that has portraits stored in cupboards, turned to face the wall, not because anyone is crying about it, but because someone might visit. It's less tragedy and more choreography. Even grief, if it exists, has to wear a neutral expression. In Rome, survival often meant performing calmness, the way a well-trained servant pours wine without reacting to the conversation, and the staff, quiet, observant people who polish floors and carry messages, become experts in new etiquette. They learn which busts are supposed to be there and which are suddenly in storage. They learn which anniversaries have been removed from the calendar. They learn that a missing name can be as dangerous as a spoken one, because absence invites questions, and questions are the opposite of restful. So everyone becomes very good at talking about the weather, the grain ships, the price of lamp oil, and how the fig crop is behaving, as if the empire's memory is just another seasonal thing. In the provinces, the empire's editing takes longer to dry. Governors repay dedications. Fort gates swap tablets. Legion standards swear loyalty to a different face, and they do it with the same solemnity they used yesterday. Far away from Rome, change is never instant. It arrives like a letter, then a second letter correcting the first letter, then a third letter reminding everyone not to mention the letters. In remote towns, old inscriptions linger, sun-pitted, almost brave. The stone outlasts the decree, the way an old password sometimes still works for a while, even after the company says it shouldn't be. Merchants, practical and softly cynical, may whisper two names for prices what it was, what it is now. Not because they love drama, but because money requires clarity and politics prefers fog. A traveler might see a statue base with a fresh rectangle of smoothness and think, without excitement, that something used to be there. Rome pretends change is instantaneous. The provinces prove time has borders. Even forgetting needs roads. And then we come to what erasures leave behind, which is the part that makes historians feel oddly satisfied, like someone finding a missing puzzle piece under a couch. Epigraphers trace letter ghosts. Drill marks confess where laurels used to rest. A blank on a triumphal list rings louder than any boast written straight. Even when you remove a face, you leave behind the shape of the removal. You can almost measure the speed of the chisel by the texture of the stone. History learns to read negative space. Absence becomes a kind of evidence, the way a freshly patched wall tells you a door used to be there. Coins, again, are wonderfully stubborn. Hoards tell timelines of faces the furnace missed by a winter, or by a farmer who buried savings and never came back to retrieve them. A pile of old denarii can preserve the wrong portrait long after the official story moved on. There is something gently comic about an emperor's attempt at eternal presence being undone by a clay pot under a floor. Rome could command armies, but it could not always command where people hid their cash. Even in an empire, someone will misplace the past. Sometimes the erasure is incomplete by accident, which is the most human outcome. A stonecutter misses a line. A local priest keeps an old dedication because no one bothered to send instructions that far. A family leaves a portrait in a back room, not as rebellion, just because it's heavy and they have other chores. Even official forgetting has a budget and a schedule, and both are subject to delays. If you listen to the Empire closely, it doesn't sound like thunder. It sounds like administration, and occasionally like someone sighing because the paperwork is late. What's left then is a landscape of careful blanks. A city full of amended sentences. A world where people learn, gently, that memory can be sanctioned. And that the punishment for remembering is often not dramatic, just inconvenient. A missed promotion, a denied favor, a door that doesn't open. Rome did not always need to threaten. It only needed to make life slightly harder for those who insisted on speaking full names. So, very softly, we end with the bedtime oath for vanishing acts. Keep facts in one jar votes, chisels, recalls, blanks. Keep rumor in another labeled light, revisable. Assume memory sanctions or power, practicing how to be delicate, never kind. Tomorrow, test one silence. Who benefits from the missing name, and who still uses it anyway? Under their breath, like an old habit they can't quite shave down. The hammer cools, the wax hardens. The marble face sleeps under a new jaw, and the inscription looks innocent in the afternoon light. The city keeps walking past its own edits, and the empire moves on quietly, as if it could keep revising forever. And you could keep listening forever, and neither of you would ever have to raise your voice. You might think erasing someone would be loud. A riot, a fire, a dramatic speech with sandals slapping marble. But Rome often preferred the quiet work of edits, the kind you notice only because the surface looks a little too smooth. Like a table that has been wiped one extra time, just to be sure no fingerprints remain, so we drift into the workshop side of forgetting. Not the Senate chamber, not the forum. The places where hands are dusty and practical, where a man's entire public identity can be reduced to a set of instructions. Shave here, fill this gap, melt that down, strike again. It is oddly calming in a way to imagine history being handled like routine maintenance, like changing a sign on a door and acting as if it always said the new thing. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe. Or don't, I'll never know. And Rome would have found that deeply comforting. A citizen who leaves no traces, from a certain point of view, wonderfully cooperative. There were tools for making a ghost, and none of them were especially mystical. They were the boring tools of an empire. Chisels, rasps, drills, stamps, scales, ledgers, wax tablets, and the steady patience of people who were paid by the day. The first tool was simply time, because stone does not like to be rushed. The second tool was a decision, because no one starts scraping a face off a statue without someone higher up saying it is suddenly polite to do so. A portrait in marble is, at heart, a set of choices. The line of a nose, the slope of a brow, the way hair curls or refuses to curl. Rome's portraiture could be flattering or brutally honest, depending on what the moment demanded, but either way it was meant to be recognizable, which is why it was also inconveniently reversible. When a man fell out of favor, a sculptor could take that recognizable face and persuade it to become someone else. Not perfectly, not magically, but enough. A jaw can be reweighted. Cheeks can be softened or tightened. Hair can be repatterned into the approved curls of the new ruler, like updating a profile picture with just enough effort to convince people you've changed. There's something gently absurd about the idea of an emperor being recut, as if he were a gemstone that no longer suited the ring, but it happened. Sometimes the old face was simply removed, leaving a blank where a head once was, which is its own kind of statement. Other times the head stayed and the features shifted, and the statue learned to be loyal to a new name without complaint. Stone has no pride. It is extremely good at adapting. The drill marks are part of the story. If you've ever watched someone remove a stubborn stain from fabric, you know the motion, scrape, check, scrape again, as if the material might suddenly confess. On marble, the drill leaves little pits, and later those pits can be smoothed, but never entirely unmade. The ghost of the old face lingers in the texture, like a sentence that was deleted, but still faintly visible if you tilt the screen at the right angle. Historians, being the kind of people who enjoy tilting things and staring too long, notice these little confessions and smile quietly to themselves. In bronze, the process could be even more final, because bronze can be persuaded into liquid. Bronze heads vanish into furnaces. A face that once looked down on crowds becomes a puddle, becomes a bar, becomes something else entirely, maybe a new statue, maybe a set of household objects, maybe a piece of armor, maybe a very unromantic hinge. It's hard to be an eternal ruler when you've been turned into a hinge, but Rome was not sentimental about materials. Rome liked reuse. Rome liked efficiency. Even memory could be recycled, apparently. Coins were another very intimate battlefield because a coin travels. It passes through hands that do not care about politics. It buys bread. It pays wages. It gets dropped into a jar, forgotten, then found again when someone finally decides to clean. A face on a coin is a small piece of propaganda you can misplace in your pocket, which meant that when a face became unacceptable, the empire had to do something about all those tiny, stubborn portraits circulating like little metallic reminders. The idea of recalling coins sounds modern, like a polite announcement from a company that something might be slightly faulty. Please return your denarii to the nearest authorized office. Thank you for your cooperation. But in practice, it was more like pressure applied through taxes and payments. Old coins come home when people pay what they owe. Old coins come home when soldiers are paid in newer issues and spend the old ones back. Old coins come home when a market begins to prefer what the government is currently endorsing. The process is slow and heavy, like trying to change the direction of a river using paperwork. Sometimes the solution was overstriking. Take an old coin, put it under a die, and strike it again so the new face sits on top of the old face like a firm correction. If you look closely at some coins, you can see remnants an eye beneath an eye, a letter beneath a letter, a nose that does not quite belong to the new portrait. It's almost tender in a strange way. The metal remembers even when the empire wants it not to. There were also the smaller luxury objects that carried names. Intaglio's engraved gemstones could be flipped, re-engraved, set again. Signet rings learned new initials without complaint. A family that once pressed a certain name into wax could, with a steady hand and a little money, press a different one. The ring itself did not care. It simply did its job. In that way, Rome's tools for erasure were often just tools for continuity. You keep the object, you change the label. You continue living because living is what people do when the state is in the mood to rearrange reality. And then there were the records. Paper and wax and whisper. If stone is public memory, wax is private memory pretending to be temporary. Wax tablets were used for drafts, for quick notes, for calculations, for things you might not want carved into permanence. The beauty of wax is that it can be erased cleanly. Worm it, smooth it, and the message disappears as if it never pressed there. Rome, always fond of useful metaphors, essentially built part of its daily bureaucracy around an eraser, which is comforting until you remember that the same softness can be used on people. Papyrus could be scraped and overwritten. A sheet might carry one message, then be scraped down and carry another, like a reused notebook page. Public records could strike lines through titles. A man's honors could be crossed out with a stroke that is physically not very dramatic. It's just ink. But ink is powerful when it sits in the right book. A line through a name can change how an inheritance is argued, how a contract is read, how a person is remembered in official terms. Bureaucracy is the art of making quiet marks that control loud lives. Private letters are where the whisper enters. People learn to switch to pronouns. They learn to write he instead of a name, and then, when he feels risky, they write nothing at all and trust the reader to understand. They learn to speak in soft ellipses, to leave gaps that only friends can fill. It's not poetic. It's practical. The safest noun becomes that man. The safest verb becomes was. The grammar itself becomes cautious, like someone tiptoeing across a floor they suspect might creak. This is where modern analogies drift in gently, because it's hard not to think of documents being updated and sanitized, of search results being quietly buried, of old versions being replaced without announcement. Rome did not have servers, but it did have archives and clerks, which is the same idea with more dust. And dust, in a way, is Rome's favorite medium. Dust settles on everything equally, and that impartiality probably felt like justice to someone. Even the official historians had to decide how to handle a missing person. Some wrote around the gap. Some leaned into it, turning the erasure into a moral lesson, because nothing makes an author happier than a convenient example. Others filed events under distractions, weather, omens, prodigies. A comet appears, a statue sweats, an animal behaves strangely in the wrong place, and suddenly the narrative has something else to talk about. It's a very sleepy technique, honestly. When the story becomes uncomfortable, you mention the weather. People still do that. And the public, the ordinary crowd, had its own relationship with these changes. Not everyone cared. Many people had never met the emperor they were asked to forget. For them, the face on the coin was mostly a design choice. The name on the arch was mostly background. What mattered was grain, rent, work, family, and whether the bathhouse was too crowded. If the state wanted to change a portrait, fine. If the state wanted to swap out an inscription, fine. People are astonishingly adaptable when they're tired and busy, and Rome made sure most people were always at least one of those things. Still, even the uninterested noticed the physical labor of forgetting. A patched inscription is visible. A statue with a reworked face looks slightly off, the way a repainted portrait sometimes does when the artist tried too hard to correct a smile. A missing name creates a blank that draws the eye, not because people are rebellious, but because humans are pattern-seeking animals who can't help noticing a rectangle of smooth stone in the middle of a sentence. Erasure, ironically, calls attention to itself. It's like trying to remove a stain by scrubbing so hard you change the fabric. There were, too, the little absurdities of implementation. Someone had to decide which statues mattered enough to fix. Someone had to budget for new dyes at the mint. Someone had to organize labor, transportation, paperwork, and supervision. Someone somewhere had to stand over a worker and confirm that yes, that letter should be filled, and no, that other letter should not be filled because it belongs to someone else, and we are not erasing the entire alphabet today. The empire could be cruel, but it was also occasionally incompetent in the ordinary ways. Delays, shortages, miscommunication, a cart breaking an axle on a bad road. And that means the erasure was often uneven. A name might be removed in Rome and still remain on a provincial inscription for decades. A coin might still circulate in a distant market because nobody bothered to collect it. A portrait might survive because it was tucked into a storage room, because it was too heavy to move, because it belonged to a private family that simply didn't feel like complying immediately. This is not heroism. This is laziness, inertia, and the gentle stubbornness of objects. History is often preserved not by courage, but by inconvenience. If you let your mind drift, you can almost hear the sounds of these tools at work: the rasp on stone, the soft tap of a chisel, the deeper clang of a hammer, the hiss of a furnace, the dull, satisfying thump of a coin being struck, the scratch of a stylus in wax. None of it is urgent. None of it needs a soundtrack. It's the sound of a world rearranging itself in slow motion, like furniture being moved in the next room while you pretend you're not listening. And then, of course, there's the final odd comfort. Rome's erasures give us something to study. The very attempts to remove a person become fingerprints. The patched rectangles, the recut jaws, the overstruck coins, the crossed out lines in a ledger. These are clues left behind by power that wanted no clues. The Empire tried to make a ghost, but it left behind the tools on the floor. It's like finding a broom in a room that insists it was never cleaned. So if you're lying there, letting the world soften around the edges, you can keep one small thought in a quiet corner. Forgetting is work. It takes hands. It takes money. It takes time. It takes people who would probably rather be doing something else, but are paid to sand down a name until it becomes smooth enough to pretend it was never there. And as the minutes pass, the micro details become their own lullaby. The exact angle of a chisel, the way bronze changes color as it heats, the tiny raised rim of a coin, the faint shine of fresh wax, the polite neatness of a clerk's handwriting, the rectangle of repaired stone catching light differently than the older surface around it. The Empire breathes in 4, out 6, and the tools keep their gentle rhythm. The hammer cools between strikes. The wax, once warm, begins to harden again. The new face on the statue settles into its borrowed expression, and the old one becomes a rumor in the marble grain. Somewhere, a coin drops into a palm, and the palm does not care. Somewhere else, a name is avoided with a pronoun, and the pronoun floats away like dust in afternoon light, and the room you're in stays quiet, and the story keeps drifting as if it could go on, calmly, without ever needing to arrive anywhere at all. You might not expect a government to look at a house and think, very calmly, yes, That one seems to have too much daylight. But once you start taxing windows, you discover an entire quiet world where light becomes paperwork, and sunshine turns into an item that can be counted, priced, and politely discouraged. Imagine it in the gentlest way. A street of brick houses breathing out warm air, and somewhere inside one of them, a family is doing the kind of normal things families do, boiling something modest, folding something slightly damp, pretending a draft is fresh air. And outside, in the same mild, ordinary weather, the state is thinking about rectangles, not gardens. Not kindness, rectangles. If a window is a hole in a wall, then a hole can be measured. And if it can be measured, it can be built. If you're still awake by the time we get to the part where people literally brick up their own windows, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. I won't send an inspector to count your attention span. This is a sleepy channel. We don't do raids. We do gentle audits. The window tax, in its most simple form, was a way of taxing wealth without asking directly about income. It's a very shy kind of tax. Instead of saying, "How much money do you have?" it says, "How many windows do you dare to own?" The assumption is that richer people enjoy more light. Poorer people apparently enjoy less light, and also fewer questions. It's like judging someone's entire financial life by how cheerful their curtains look, which is not a perfect system, but it does have a certain tired logic. In late 17th century England, and for a long time after, windows became a quiet signal. A large house with many panes was not only a place to live, it was a statement that said, "I can afford to see." The tax began in 1696, and it shifted over time, because nothing stays still once it enters the hands of lawmakers. Rates changed, thresholds changed. Exemptions appeared and disappeared like small clouds. The basic mood stayed the same, though. The state wanted to look at the outside of your home and estimate your inside. It helps to remember that this was not a world of bright electric light at the flick of a switch. Daylight mattered more. A window was not just aesthetic. It was the difference between reading and squinting, between sewing neatly and sewing creatively, between seeing the dust and only sensing it. In winter, when the afternoons fell away early, light was a resource that ran out, and people noticed when it ran out even faster. So a window, in the most boringly dramatic way, could become a luxury. Not a jeweled luxury, not a champagne luxury, but a practical rectangular luxury. Which means, of course, it became something people tried to negotiate with. People always negotiate with rectangles when money is involved. They negotiate with room sizes, with property lines, with the shape of a loaf of bread. If you tax windows, you will meet the human instinct to redefine the word window until it is tired enough to stop arguing. What counts as a window, anyway? Is it a large pane? Is it a small pane? Is it a half window? Is it a skylight? Is it an opening that used to be a window, but is now filled with something that technically is an T-wall, but also isn't really window anymore? If you've ever watched someone try to avoid an extra fee by insisting their bag is not luggage, it's a personal item, you already understand the tone. Only here, the personal item is a hole in your house. Officials had to count. Someone had to show up, or at least someone had to be prepared to show up, and create a number that could be written in a book. The idea of a window inspector sounds faintly comedic, like a person whose entire career is looking at buildings and whispering, too bright. But it was real work. Counting is always real work when it leads to payment, and counting windows is not as simple as it sounds, because houses are not neat in the way a form is neat. Houses have back windows, side windows, courtyard windows, odd little stair windows that exist mostly to keep you from falling down in the dark. Houses have windows that belong to servants' rooms, which are sometimes treated as barely there until they become taxable. Houses have remodels. Houses have extensions. Houses have the kind of architectural improvisation that happens when someone says, let's just add a little more space, and no one asks what little means. So the tax did what taxes always do. It encouraged people to change their behavior, not in grand heroic ways, in small, stubborn, dusty ways. If windows cost money, then fewer windows cost less money. And so, slowly, quietly, a strange new style appeared on streets, bricked up windows. Beautiful houses with blank patches, as if someone had carefully erased parts of their own face. The bricked up window is one of the most sleep-inducing artifacts in architectural history. It's not a castle. It's not a battlefield. It's just a rectangle of older brickwork filled with newer brickwork, sometimes clumsily, sometimes neatly, always a little obvious if you know what to look for. The outline lingers, the lintel remains. The house remembers that it used to see out of that place. Picture a homeowner standing in a room that used to be brighter, watching a mason do the slow, polite violence of closing up light. Brick by brick, mortar smoothed. A final pat like tucking in a blanket. The room becomes dimmer, and everyone pretends this is normal now. They might even tell themselves it is cozy. Humans are very good at calling things cozy when the alternative is unaffordable. And then come the workarounds. Because if there is one thing history teaches us, besides the fact that everyone loved receipts more than they admitted it, is that people dislike paying for things they can avoid paying for. Exemptions existed for smaller houses and thresholds shifted. And there were moments when the tax felt like it was aimed more clearly at the comfortable classes. But the details matter because details always do, and also because details are wonderfully boring. Some households tried to argue their way out. Some tried to build in ways that looked modest on paper. Some grouped windows differently. Some used smaller openings. Some relied more on internal courtyards or light wells. Some simply accepted darker rooms and adjusted their routines, doing the needlework near the remaining window, moving the dining table closer to the light, saving certain tasks for midday, like a quiet appointment with the sun. There's also the gentle irony that windows were linked to ventilation and health. Air moves through openings. Light discourages certain kinds of damp gloom. When you reduce windows, you can create rooms that feel heavier, especially in crowded cities where smoke and soot already had a strong opinion about where they wanted to settle. If you tax light and air, you may accidentally encourage darkness and stale air. History is full of policies that accidentally encourage the opposite of what anyone would publicly call good. This is where the micro-absurdities bloom softly. A society begins to treat sunlight as if it's an optional upgrade. A family learns to accept one window fewer as if the sky itself has become a luxury brand. A builder designs a house while quietly thinking about tax brackets, which is a less romantic muse than most people hope for in architecture. And somewhere, someone is doing sums with windows the way we do sums with subscription tiers, counting what we can tolerate before we sigh and pay. Inspectors and clerks and local officials had to live inside the system. Some were strict, some were flexible. Some looked the other way if they liked to, which is a timeless administrative technique. Disputes happened, because disputes always happen when a number is attached to a human space. People argued over whether a particular opening was truly a window. They argued over ownership and occupancy. They argued over repairs that change counts. They argued because arguing is cheaper than paying, at least at first. It's also worth drifting through the social meaning of it all. A house with many windows could be admired, but it could also be a target for the quiet judgment of neighbors who believed you were showing off. A house with fewer windows might look modest, but it might also look frankly sad. The street became a gallery of compromise. Who chose light, who chose savings, who chose to pretend they never liked sunshine anyway. In some towns, you could read the history of payments in the walls. Old brick around a sealed window. A later renovation reopening a space when the rules changed or when money returned. A patchwork of decisions, each one small, each one practical, none of them meant for drama, all of them leaving marks that outlasted the people who made them. It's the opposite of a monument. It's a record of reluctance. And because humans cannot resist a little irony, the very attempt to tax windows turned windows into a symbol. The tax became known later as a tax on light. Even if the policymakers didn't say it quite that poetically, the public understood the feeling. To be taxed for the simple act of letting daylight into your home feels, on some instinctive level, like being charged for breathing. Breathe in 4, out 6, and imagine someone standing by with a ledger. Over time, criticism grew, partly because of the health arguments, partly because it felt unfair, and partly because the bricked-up windows were visible evidence of a policy working exactly as intended, which is rarely a flattering sight. When the window tax was finally repealed in the 19th century, it didn't instantly return daylight to every room. Habits persist, walls stay where they are. A bricked-up window doesn't reopen itself out of gratitude. Someone has to decide to undo it, and undoing things always costs money, which is why many old buildings still carry those quiet scars. That's one of the gentlest lessons of boring history. Decisions become architecture. Architecture becomes normal. Normal becomes invisible. And then, centuries later, someone walks down a street and notices a strange rectangle of mismatched brick and thinks, very softly, why is that there? The answer is not romance. The answer is bureaucracy. If you want an even smaller detail to hold on to, consider the way a bricked-up window changes a room's sound. Less glass, more brick, a slightly different hush. The house becomes a little more closed, a little more inward. The outside world dims, and the inside world grows heavier with its own warm air and its own private noises. If history were a lullaby, it would be made of these tiny physical changes: mortar drying, dust settling, sunlight landing on fewer surfaces. And then there are the records, because of course there are. Taxes generate paper the way fireplaces generate ash. Lists of properties, counts, assessments, exemptions, payments. Names of householders who may not have thought their legacy would include the phrase 12 windows. But there it is, written down, preserved by the same tedious forces that preserve so many other details of life. The need to know, to count, to charge, to confirm. Somewhere in those documents, you can almost hear the rhythm of the system. A clerk copying numbers, a local official approving them, a payment made, a receipt issued, a small sigh of relief, and then the next house, the next number, the next rectangle of daylight turned into a line of ink. It's not exciting. It's not meant to be. It is the kind of history that makes your eyelids feel heavier because it reminds you how much of civilization is just counting. So tonight, well, not tonight, just now in this quiet moment, let the ideas settle without tension. A tax that measured light. A society that responded by gently reducing its own brightness. A street that learned to accept blank patches on its face. 1,000 small choices made without speeches, leaving behind the calm evidence of their existence in brick and mortar. Keep facts in one-jar dates, rates, windows, thresholds. Keep the feeling in another dim rooms, polite arguments, patched rectangles, the soft stubbornness of people trying to keep a little warmth and a little money at the same time. Assume most of it was decided on ordinary mornings, with ordinary worries, by ordinary people who didn't want drama. They just wanted the bill to be smaller. And if you ever notice a sealed window in an old wall, you can let it be what it is. A sleepy reminder that history often happens in silence. The mortar hardens, the glass disappears, the room adjusts, the street moves on, and the light, patient as ever, waits outside, shining on the bricks without insisting on being let in. A hammer ticks on marble the way a clock might, If a clock had calluses and an opinion about politics. Wax warms beneath a stylus, not dramatically, just enough to take an impression without making a fuss. Somewhere in afternoon light, a name thins to dust slowly, politely, as if even the letters are trying not to disturb anyone. And quietly, before we begin drifting any further, where and what time are you listening from? If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the air settle into its own small laws. And if you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe purely as a ceremonial gesture, like placing a tiny offering on a shelf, or don't. Either way, no Roman clerk will appear to record your decision in tidy handwriting, and no one will commission a statue of your finger hovering over a button. Rome, for all its ambition, never quite mastered that particular form of surveillance. The thing we call Damnatio Memoriae sounds like a thunderclap. It's Latin, it's heavy. It feels like a curse you'd whisper into a torch-lit corridor. But the reality is often quieter, a Senate decision that becomes an instruction, and an instruction that becomes a routine. Not burial, exactly, but subtraction. Not let us mourn, but let us remove. A life is converted into tasks. Cancel honors, stop sacrifices, pull down images, scrape names, revise the public story so it stops repeating a face that has become inconvenient. It is the empire practicing the art of pretending it never looked directly at something. Imagine the Senate as a room where people sit for a long time and try to make standing up look dignified afterward. Hands lift. A formula is spoken. Someone's memory is treated like a public object that can be repossessed. A copy of the decision goes to an office because Rome loved offices. Another copy goes to a workshop because Rome loved things being physically done to other things. Another goes to a priesthood because the gods also needed to be informed of the updated policy. As if Jupiter might accidentally say the wrong name at a banquet and make it awkward for everyone. And then the chisel enters, not as a symbol, but as a tool with a normal workday. A stonecutter is shown an inscription that used to be proud letters, cut deep, spaced carefully, meant to last. Now, someone points and says, in effect, please make this not say that. The stonecutter does not ask why. Stonecutters rarely have the luxury of why. They have mortar, they have drills. They have the steady patience it takes to remove one letter without cracking the line beneath it. There is a peculiar tenderness in this kind of erasure. You must know the inscription well enough to undo it without destroying everything around it. Sometimes the removal is clean. Sometimes it is a compromise. If you take too much stone, the whole slab could weaken, and then you have a bigger problem than memory. So you get solutions that feel almost modern. Plug the letters, plane the surface, leave a neat rectangle where the name used to be, like a carefully censored document. The blank becomes official. It is silence you can point to. It is absence engineered to hold its shape. And it spreads outward into the city's public vocabulary. Triumphal arches lose their dedications. Altars quietly forget who paid for them. Milestones, those confident little announcements that you are exactly this far from somewhere important, shed the name of the sponsor like a snake, shedding a skin it no longer wants to be seen wearing. The roads remain. The distances remain. Only the bragline changes. The map stays the same. The legend is rewritten. The streets rehearse the revision overnight. If you have ever seen a sign replaced and noticed that everyone still calls the place by its old name for months, you already understand the basic problem. Memory is sticky and stone is only one kind of surface. The city also learns how to unname things without moving them. A dedication is removed, but the fountain still runs. A plaque is altered, but the arch still casts shade. The structure stands there, continuing its quiet duties, while the text attached to it becomes less personal. Rome discovers a strange comfort in this. You can keep the useful object and delete the troublesome credit. It's like keeping the chair and deleting the thank you note. And then, because Rome could never resist efficiency, the work moves from names to faces. If a name can be taken off a wall, a face can be adjusted too. A portrait is not just art. It is a public instruction. This is who you salute, who you swear by, who you should imagine whenever you hear the word order. So when the order changes, the portrait can change with it. Marble heads are removed. New heads are fitted. A neck gets smoothed, a new chin arrives, and the statue obedient, silent becomes someone else without complaint. It's the gentlest kind of identity theft, performed with sand and steady hands. There were workshops that specialized in this because, of course, there were. Rome could industrialize anything, including the rewriting of a face. Hairlines shift. Jawlines become firmer or less firm, depending on what the new ruler thinks firmness should look like. The eyes, those carved pupils meant to stare into eternity, are made to belong to a different person. And if you stand too long in front of one of these ray-cut portraits, you can sometimes feel the faint wrongness of it, like a reused envelope with the old address scratched out. The marble is pretending. The marble is very good at pretending. Coins, too, are a part of the same soft machinery. A coin is a tiny, portable billboard that everyone touches. It is the most intimate kind of propaganda because it sits in your palm and goes into your pocket and pays for bread. When the face on the coin becomes politically embarrassing, the embarrassment travels widely, jingling. So coins can be recalled, melted down, restruck, and quietly replaced with a new face that is safer to carry around. Imagine a government recalling all the small change in the empire because the portrait is no longer approved. It is both absurd and completely logical, which is a very Roman combination. Bronze images disappear into furnaces. Silver coinage comes home through taxes and then mysteriously does not return to circulation because it has been asked to become something else. Dies are re-engraved. Old portraits are reshaped into new ones. Sometimes you can still feel the ghost of the earlier image in the metal, in the way a design looks slightly crowded or oddly spaced, as if the coin itself is trying to remember what it used to say. The budget calls it recoinage or repairs. The people call it, why does this face look different from last week? And then they go back to buying olives. And it wasn't only coins and statues. Rome also had softer surfaces, papyrus, wax tablets, wooden boards painted with lists of officials, archives full of names that mattered mainly because they were written down. Papyrus can be scraped and reused. Wax tablets can be warmed and leveled smooth, so yesterday's message becomes a quiet, blank promise. Public records can have lines drawn through titles. Private letters can develop a sudden love of pronouns. He becomes safer than Marcus. That man becomes safer than the former emperor, especially if you enjoy having property. There is a particular hush that settles over a language when everyone is trying to be careful. The safest verb becomes was, not did, not ordered, not promised, just was. It's almost soothing. In a sleepy way, like the whole city has agreed to speak in half-finished sentences, so no one has to commit to a noun. Chroniclers can help this happen without even trying. They can file events under storms, under omens, under unrest, under a difficult season. The universe becomes the main character. The missing name becomes a space everyone steps around like a wet patch on a mosaic floor. And the odd thing is, none of this creates a clean silence. It creates a careful silence, which is different. A clean silence would mean nothing remains. A careful silence means the edges are still there. People remember the old face, but they stop saying it out loud. They remember the old titles, but they phrase them differently. They learn the skill of speaking as if they are walking with a full cup, slowly, avoiding sudden moves. Now we drift softly into the collateral effects, the places where erasure stops being theatrical and becomes domestic, houses, heirs, stuff, but people who must keep living. inside a family name that the state has decided to misplace. Statues and atriums can be removed or turned to face the wall, which is a very human gesture for a piece of stone. Household gods, the little Larrys, might receive quieter offerings because it's awkward to be seen praying too enthusiastically in a household that has fallen out of favor. Family seals get boxed up because seals are signatures, and signatures are dangerous when your old patron's name has been officially discouraged. Heirs have to be practical. They can't live entirely on defiance. Defiance is expensive, so they adapt. They trade cognomina. They lean on the names of other relatives. They adopt new patrons. They emphasize older branches of the family tree, like someone carefully rearranging a bookshelf to make a certain volume less visible. Freedmen, too, shift their paperwork. Contracts don't like controversy. Loans prefer stability. Even friendships, that supposedly warm human thing, can turn into a cold calculation when association becomes risky. Old favors are repaid in distance, not thanks. Confiscations can arrive with receipts, because Rome could turn punishment into administration as neatly as it could turn stone into a blank rectangle, and enforcement is often routine rather than dramatic. A visit, a list, a check. Someone making sure a removed name is not being used in the wrong place, at the wrong time, on the wrong inscription. It is bureaucratic sleepwalking, the empire moving through its own corridors, doing what empires do, half awake but persistent. And beyond the city, the provinces do their own slow version of remembering and forgetting. Governors repaint dedications. Fort gates swap tablets. Legion standards, those cloth and metal symbols that soldiers treat as sacred, quietly swear loyalty to a different face. In some remote town, though, the old inscription can linger simply because no one has brought the right tools yet. Bureaucracy has limits. Those limits are often measured in travel time, weather, and whether the local mason is busy repairing someone's roof. Merchants adapt in the way merchants always adapt, by speaking in two versions at once. There is the official name you use when a magistrate is nearby, and the old name you use when you are bargaining with someone who has known you for years. Prices whisper two histories, what it was called, what it is called now. Rome pretends change is instant. The provinces prove time has borders. If you have ever watched a new rule take weeks to actually reach the last person in a group, you have again brushed against the empire's problem. Orders travel faster than habits. And then when the dust settles and the statues have been rearranged and the coins have been melted and the wax has been smoothed, we arrive at the last quietest part, the part that historians love because it's made of small clues that don't shout. Reading the holes, reading the blank rectangles, reading the drill marks where a wreath used to rest, the scraped patches where letters once stood in proud lines. A blank on a list can ring louder than a sentence, like a pause that feels too intentional to be natural. Epigraphers, those patient people who study inscriptions the way some people study clouds, trace letter ghosts. They measure spacing. They notice that a word is missing, but the line still feels designed, suggesting something was carefully removed rather than never written. Coin hoards tell timelines too. A face appears, then disappears, then returns in altered form, like a recurring character who has been recast. Sometimes a winter or a distant region saves an old coin from the furnace, and centuries later it becomes a tiny metallic argument against the empire's attempt at tidiness. Even Riquette portraits betray themselves if you look long enough. The hairline might be slightly off. The ears might not match the style of the new period. The proportions might feel subtly strained, like a suit tailored for one person and then forced to fit another. Stone remembers by accident. Metal remembers by survival. Paper remembers by being copied and recopied until someone, somewhere, preserves the older version out of habit or stubbornness or simple forgetfulness. And in this way, the Empire's erasures become evidence. The missing becomes informative. Negative space becomes a kind of proof. It's almost comforting in a strange bedtime way. Power can remove names from monuments, but it cannot fully control what absence looks like. The gap itself has a shape. The gap becomes a whisper that lasts. So, as we let the final scene soften, you can treat Damnatio Memoriae not as a magical deletion, but as a ritual of control performed with ordinary tools. Keep facts in one jar: votes, chisels, recut faces, recalled coins, scraped tablets, blank rectangles. Keep rumor in another labeled, light, revisable, the way people keep old stories without putting them on official shelves. Assume memory sanctions our power practicing how to be delicate, never kind. And if you want a small, sleepy experiment for tomorrow, you can test one silence. Ask quietly who benefits from the missing name and who still uses it anyway. For now, just listen to the small sounds again. The hammer cooling on the bench, the wax hardening into smoothness, the reed pen scratching in calm little lines, the marble face resting under its new jaw, wearing its replacement identity like a mask that never sweats. Rome moves on, because Rome always moves on, and the erased person remains stubborn in their absence like the pale outline a picture leaves on a wall after it has been taken down, still visible if the light hits it gently, and if you don't look too hard, and if you let your eyes drift the way they meant to drift when it is late, and the world has stopped asking you for names. You might not expect a government to look at a perfectly ordinary window and think, yes, that is where the money is hiding. But here we are. A pane of glass sits quietly in its wooden frame, doing what panes of glass have always done, which is mostly nothing, and yet it manages to invite an inspector's footsteps. Somewhere nearby, a quill scratches a tally. Somewhere else, a brick is lifted with the careful seriousness of public finance. And before we drift any further into this gentle nonsense, where and what time are you listening from? If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the air be a soft rule book with very few rules. And if you're still awake by the time we reach the part where people willingly well up their own sunlight, you can subscribe. Or don't. Either option is wonderfully low effort, which is the only kind of effort we respect at this hour dot in late 17th century Britain. The state developed a particular fascination with the number of windows in your house. Not the sturdiness of your roof, not the quality of your soup, not even the moral character of your curtains. Just windows, openings, rectangles of daylight. In 1696, a tax arrived that treated windows as a convenient clue. The thinking was simple in that sleepy way governments sometimes enjoy. Bigger houses tend to have more windows, and bigger houses tend to belong to people who can pay. It's like using the number of charging cables on someone's desk to guess their income, except with more soot and fewer adapters dot, so the window becomes a kind of confession. Each pane says, quietly, I belong to someone who expects to see. A home with many windows is a home that can afford to let light spill in without worrying too much about the cost of glass, the cost of repairs, the cost of drafts, the cost of having one more thing that can break. And the state looks at that spilled light and decides it should be politely invoiced out at first. It sounds almost elegant. No need to count everyone's coins. No need to rummage through private ledgers. Just walk down a street and let the facades do the talking. A row of houses becomes a line of arithmetic. You can imagine the bureaucratic satisfaction. The world has provided a visible metric, and the treasury can simply look. There is something calming about a tax that can be confirmed by standing outside and squinting dot, of course. The moment you tax something visible, people begin to adjust what is visible. They do this quietly with a kind of determination that does not require shouting. They do it the way people always do it, by changing the object instead of changing themselves. If windows are taxed, then windows can be reduced. If daylight costs money, Then daylight can be treated like a luxury product you might enjoy in moderation. And so the bricked up window enters history, not as an artistic statement, but as a financial strategy. Bricklayers become part-time accountants. A window that once opened onto the street is filled in carefully so the outer world sees a smooth wall where a bright rectangle used to be. From the inside, you might still see the outline. You might still feel the slightly different temperature where the wall has been thickened. It's like the house has a memory of its own earlier optimism. There is a small absurdity here that arrives gently and stays. People pay to build windows because windows are useful. Then people pay again to remove windows because windows are expensive. The same opening is first a sign of comfort, then a sign of risk. It is a tiny domestic tragedy performed with mortar, except we promised no drama. So let's call it a domestic inconvenience performed with very committed paperwork. The law itself drifted and shifted over the years, with thresholds and bans and exemptions that sound almost like lullabies if you read them slowly enough. Some houses paid a flat rate and then extra per window. Some revisions tried to make it fairer, which is a word that always arrives wearing a slightly anxious expression. And people, in response, became oddly knowledgeable about their own architecture. Suddenly, households that had never cared about counting anything more complex than spoons became experts in counting openings. Asterisk. You can picture the sleepy rhythm of it. An inspector arrives, perhaps in a coat that has seen rain. He looks up. He counts. He writes. Someone inside pretends to be busy with something very important, like existing. Someone else wonders if that small window in the back counts as a window if it is mostly covered by a shelf. These are the kinds of philosophical questions that only appear when money is involved. And everyone is tired, and then the micro-absurdities begin to bloom. Softly, like dust motes in a beam of light that is still allowed. Some people built fake windows because a symmetrical facade was fashionable, and it looks odd when one side has fewer windows than the other. So you end up with a painted suggestion of a window that never let in light, which feels like cheating, but in a very decorative way. Other people kept the window on the outside and blocked it on the inside, or vice versa, like a house performing a two-sided negotiation with reality. Sometimes the bricking was so common that entire streets acquired a slightly sealed expression, as if the buildings had decided to blink and never reopen their eyes. In certain towns, you can still see these filled-in windows today. The brickwork slightly different, the outline faint but stubborn. It's like an architectural scar that refuses to stop being educational. Health, unsurprisingly, does not thrive on being treated as optional. When light and air become taxable vibes, poorer households, already crowded, already smoky, already damp, could find themselves living in rooms that had fewer ways to breathe. And it's not that anyone sat down and said, yes, let's reduce ventilation for the working classes as a treat. It's simply what happens when a policy meets a wall, and the wall meets a budget, and everyone tries to do the math with cold fingers. But for now, keep it gentle. Think of the window as a very quiet actor. It does not argue. It does not campaign. It simply exists, and the state decides it should be counted. The house responds by turning architecture into strategy. It's a soft, repetitive loop. Rule, response, revision, response again. Like waves, but made of brick stout as the years pass, the window tax becomes part of the background hum of domestic life. People mention it the way you mention the weather annoying. Constant, vaguely unfair, and not something you can easily fight without getting wet. Builders and landlords start to factor it into designs. Tenants learn that a bright room might also be a more expensive room, which is the kind of trade-off that makes you sigh and then rearrange. Your chair closer to the one remaining window, and while the wealthy could often absorb the cost, the tax still encouraged a certain thriftiness, even among those who could afford comfort. because sometimes it's not about need. It's about principle. There is a special pleasure in refusing to pay for something you feel you already own, like daylight. You can imagine a landowner gazing at a sunny room and thinking, I did not ask the sun to show up. And yet here we are with an invoice. The work of enforcement remains oddly intimate. Unlike a distant tax on trade or property, this is a tax that requires someone to look at your house, to stand there and count your choices. And because of that, it produces a kind of quiet social theater. A respectable facade becomes both style and declaration. A bricked window becomes both savings and statement. Even the absence of light becomes visible from the street. And that's a peculiar thing, poverty and thrift taking shape as masonry dot in some places. The phrase daylight robbery drifts into popular language, often linked to the window tax. Even if language does what it always does and refuses to be fully obedient to a single origin story, either way, the phrase fits the mood. You are being charged, in some symbolic sense, for what falls into your house from the sky. It's hard not to feel mildly insulted by that, even if you are too sleepy to fully commit to the insult. Meanwhile, cities continue to grow. Industrial smoke continues to behave like a heavy curtain no one asked for. And houses packed close, built quickly, occupied tightly benefit from windows more than ever. Light becomes not just pleasant, but practical. A window is a tool for seeing your own hands. It is an escape route for stale air. It is the difference between reading and guessing. And yet it remains, stubbornly, part of the taxable surface of your life. The social consequences are not loud, but they are persistent. Darker rooms mean more candles, and candles mean cost, and cost means trade-offs, and trade-offs mean you quietly give up something else. Damp rooms mean illness lingers. Crowded rooms mean breath becomes communal, and it's not dramatic in a single moment. It's cumulative like dust. That's often how policy hurts when it isn't trying to. It simply leans on you every day until you learn to lean back. Or you slump thought now, if you're still awake. Notice how quickly the story becomes repetitive, which is perfect for sleep. Count brick, count, again, adjust, argue quietly, repeat. You can almost hear the gentle rhythm of the era, the scrape of a trowel, the tap of a quill, the small sigh of someone who would like one more window, but would also like to keep one more coin. Asterisk eventually. Public pressure builds in the slow way public pressure tends to build, through complaints, pamphlets, debates, and the steady accumulation of people saying, perhaps we should not tax the basic architecture of breathing. Reform movements begin to point out what many already feel in their bones, that a window is not the same thing as a luxury. It is a necessity that happens to be visible and still. The tax lingers for a long time, decades, generations. Children grow up in houses with bricked windows and think that's just what houses look like. The way you might grow up with a particular annoying app update and assume the world has always been slightly less convenient. Policy can shape taste. It can also shape resignation. When repeal finally arrives in the 19th century, it doesn't instantly unbrick the world. Walls keep their habits. Buildings do not change overnight just because a law does. Some windows are reopened, yes, light returns like a polite guest who has been invited back after a long absence. But many bricked windows remain bricked because reopening costs money, and money is always the quiet co-author of architecture. Besides, a wall that has been solid for decades feels strangely final, as if the house has gotten used to its own narrowed gaze. And that's the afterlife of this whole sleepy episode. The evidence stays in the bricks. You can walk through older neighborhoods and notice the filled-in rectangles, the subtle difference in brick color, the way mortar lines don't quite match. The house becomes a document. The facade becomes a record. The missing window becomes a little historical footnote you can see without reading anything, which is convenient because reading anything at bedtime is ambitious. So if you want to end with a gentle oath, nothing too bold. Just the kind of promise you make to yourself and immediately forget keep facts in one jar. 1696. Counting windows, inspectors, thresholds, bricked rectangles, dark rooms, stubborn walls. Keep feelings in another jar. The soft irritation of being charged for light. The quiet pride of outsmarting a rule with a few bricks. The slow recognition that clever sometimes comes with a cost you don't see until later. And tomorrow, if you remember, you can test one small thought. Whenever someone taxes something visible, people will start rearranging what can be seen. Sometimes they rearrange it with paint, sometimes with paperwork, sometimes in the most literal way possible, with a brick placed carefully into a former opening, sealing up a rectangle of daylight as if the sun were a subscription service you decided to cancel. For now, let the scene in gently. Imagine the last inspector turning away down the street, his counting done for the day. Imagine the trowel set down. Imagine the room inside quieter, a little darker, but still warm enough to exist in. The wall holds its shape. The dust settles into the corners, and the remaining window, whatever its size, keeps doing its patient work, letting in just enough light to soften the edges of everything, until even the idea of attacks feels far away, like a distant rule in a distant ear, written in neat ink that has already begun to fade. You might not expect a country to misplace 11 days the way you misplace a sock, and yet, at one point, Britain did exactly that quietly. Officially, with paperwork, and with the confident air of someone rearranging furniture while insisting the room was always like this. Somewhere a church bell keeps steady time, somewhere a clerk's pen scratches like a small insect, and somewhere a calendar sits on a table looking mildly offended. And before we let the dates drift any further, where and what time are you listening from? If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the air be soft and unambitious. If you're still awake when we reach the part where people argue with the concept of Thursday, you can subscribe or don't. I won't chase you down the hallway with a calendar. That would be undignified, and also a little hard to schedule now. The problem starts with something very boring and very powerful. The earth does not care what we write in our diaries. The seasons keep moving, the sun keeps showing up with stubborn regularity, and humans keep trying to pin all of it down with neat boxes and numbers. For a long time, much of Europe used the Julian calendar, which was basically a well-meaning attempt to tidy up the year and keep it in one place. It worked, except it didn't work perfectly. It was off by a tiny amount each year, and tiny amounts have a patient personality. They gather, they accumulate, they wait quietly in a corner until someone notices the corner has turned into a small mountain of error by the 1500s. That gentle error had grown into a noticeable drift. Religious calendars were especially sensitive to this because feast days and equinoxes are fussy about being on time. So in 1582, Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar, which trimmed the drift with an adjustment that sounds simple until you imagine implementing it across a continent of people who already disliked their neighbors' cooking. 10 days were skipped in places that adopted it right away, like a magician's trick done with dates instead of cards. Thursday became Friday and nobody got a refund. Some countries adjusted quickly, others waited. Britain, being Britain, took its time and continued living a little behind the rest of Europe. Like a person who refuses to update their phone because they prefer the old interface. When Britain finally decided to switch in the 1700s, it did so in a way that feels both decisive and slightly surreal. In 1752, the decision was made. the country would adopt the Gregorian calendar. And because Britain had waited so long, the correction needed was larger. Not 10 days, but 11. So the calendar did something that sounds like a bedtime riddle. After Wednesday, the 2nd of September, 1752, the next day was Thursday the 14th. In between those numbers, the days were simply not used. They weren't celebrated. They weren't mourned. They were just not on the official menu. Breathe in 4, out 6, and imagine waking up and being told your week has a hole in it. Like a missing stair you're expected to step over, politely dot, of course. A nation doesn't change time by snapping its fingers. It changes time by printing new almanacs, rewriting rules, and asking a lot of ordinary people to behave as if nothing strange is happening. Clerks had to adjust ledgers. Courts had to adjust dates on filings. Churches had to adjust schedules. People who made a living selling calendars, yes, that was a thing, had to sell a product that now came with a built-in surprise. And you can picture the first moment someone realizes what this means for their birthday. Not the emotional part, just the arithmetic part. If your birthday was in those missing days, did you still get older? Were you technically ageless for 11 days? That's the kind of philosophical question that sounds deep until you remember it's mostly about cake dot. There are also the everyday worries that always show up when rules touch wallets, rent, wages, contracts. If you pay rent on a certain day each month and the month suddenly jumps forward, does the landlord still expect the same amount? Landlords have historically been very good at expecting things, so yes, they probably tried. Wage workers might wonder if they were being shorted 11 days of pay. Employers might respond with the gentle logic of someone holding a closed coin purse. It isn't that you lost pay, it's that time moved differently, which is an argument that sounds convincing only if you say it slowly and nobody asks follow-up questions. Asterisk. It's often said that some people protested with the phrase, "Give us our 11 days," and whether or not every retelling gets the details exactly right, the idea makes sense in a sleepy human way. People do not like it when you move their world without asking. Even if the sun still rises and the bread still bakes and the cows remain unimpressed, the mind wants the calendar to be stable. A calendar is supposed to be a boring friend, not a trickster. And yet, for a brief moment, Britain's calendar behaved like an absent-minded librarian who reshelves a book in the wrong decade. If you lean in close to the dull machinery of it, the change is mostly made of ink. Imagine a clerk in a small office turning pages, drawing lines through old dates, writing new ones with careful penmanship. There's a peculiar intimacy in it. The state announces a reform, and the reform becomes real when a human hand writes 14 where 3 might have been. That hand might be tired. It might belong to someone who thinks calendars are ridiculous. It might belong to someone who enjoys the mild power of correcting time on paper. And it might belong to someone who is simply paid by the hour and would like the hour to stay where it is. And then there's the strange calm of the physical world continuing as usual. The tide comes in. The tide goes out. People still sweep doorsteps. The market still smells like onions and damp wool. Only the labels change. It's like renaming all your folders on a computer while the files inside remain exactly the same. Your brain knows the content hasn't changed, but the new names make you feel as if something has shifted in the furniture of reality. You walk through the same morning, but you write a different number at the top of your letter. And suddenly, you're aware that time is partly a social agreement one, enforced politely, with stamps and seals. The calendar reform also tangled with another quiet oddity, Britain's old habit of treating the new year as beginning on March 25th rather than January 1st, at least for certain legal and official purposes, which means that if you lived in Britain before the change, You could find yourself in a year that began in spring, like nature's version of a fiscal year. When the reforms came through, Britain shifted to January 1st as the start of the year, which sounds normal now, but at the time it was another small rearrangement of mental furniture. So people not only lost days, they also had to reimagine when a year begins, which is a lot to ask of someone who just wants to sell cheese without doing philosophy. This is where the microhooks start to appear, like tiny paper cuts of historical detail. Newspapers and pamphlets had to print explanations for the public, because nothing says trust us like a printed sheet telling you the day is not what you think it is. Almanac makers had to be very careful, because the wrong date is like an off-key note in a lullaby. It feels small, but it irritates the whole song. Some towns rang bells as usual. Bells are wonderfully conservative. They don't like innovation. If a bell rings at a certain time, it rings. It doesn't care whether the date is official. In a way, bells are the most soothing part of this story. They remind you that timekeeping is partly noise and habit, not just numbers. There's also a gentle irony in the larger reason behind the change. The whole point was to align the calendar more accurately with the sun and seasons, to make timekeeping more honest. So, in order to be more accurate, the country had to do something that felt absurdly inaccurate, like skipping ahead in a book to correct the page numbers. It's like fixing your household budget by setting fire to a few receipts. The logic is real, but the method has a slightly theatrical flair. And while we're here, drifting among dates, there's the sleepy little detail of why the Gregorian calendar is better at staying aligned. It adjusts leap years differently. In the Julian system, leap years arrive regularly every 4 years, like a dependable guest. In the Gregorian system, leap years are mostly every 4 years, except when they are at century. Years are skipped unless divisible by 400. That sentence alone is a perfect cure for wakefulness. It's mathematics dressed as etiquette. It's the calendar saying, I will give you an extra day, but only under specific conditions, and only if you fill out the correct form in triplicate. So Britain steps into the new system, and daily life eventually stops noticing. Humans are very good at adapting when adaptation is required, and nobody offers an alternative. After a while, you simply write the new dates. Your appointments still happen. Your tea still cools at the same speed. The sky still produces rain with the enthusiasm of someone paid per cloud. The missing days become a story people tell, more than a wound people feel. If anything, the tale becomes a gentle historical party trick. Did you know we once skipped 11 days? It's the kind of fact that sounds dramatic, but is mostly administrative. Still, the after effects linger in the quiet corners of records. Historians have to pay attention to old style and new style dates, especially in the period around the change. You'll see a date written with 2 years, like February 11th, 1731-32, because the writer and the system were not fully in agreement about what year it technically was. That double dating feels like the past whispering, I'm trying my best. Please be patient. It's also proof that time, on paper, is sometimes negotiated rather than declared, and there's something almost comforting about that. We tend to imagine history as firm and certain events happen on dates, in order, like beads on a string. But the calendar reform shows the string can be retied. The beads can be relabeled, and everyone carries on anyway, because the real world is less interested in neatness than we are. A harvest does not wait for Parliament. A baby does not postpone being born because the date is confusing. A candle burns down at the same speed regardless of what the ledger says. If you're still awake, you can imagine the simplest scene. A person in 1752 going to sleep on September 2nd and waking up on September 14th. Not because the night was long, but because the label changed. The bed feels the same. The room smells the same. The body feels the same mild stiffness of morning. And yet the calendar has leaped, and now you're expected to act as if you personally agreed to the leap. It's oddly modern, really like waking up to a software update you didn't request. Finding the buttons moved and being told it's for accuracy. So keep facts in one jar. Julian Drift. Gregorian adjustment, 1752. September 2nd, becoming September 14th. The slow labor of clerks and printers and bell ringers who had to keep the world readable. Keep feelings in another jar. The soft annoyance of losing days. The faint amusement of a nation editing time. The sleepy realization that most of what we call time is a shared filing system. And as the night settles, let the missing days become what they mostly are now. A quiet gap in a page. A blank space that doesn't need to be filled, just noticed. The ink dries. The bells fade. The calendar lies flat on the table, behaving again, pretending it has never done anything strange in its life, while outside the sky keeps its own slow count, steady and indifferent, as if it has all the time in the world, because, in a way, it does. You might not expect an empire to stay stitched together by something as delicate as warmed wax and slightly damp paper, but for centuries a lot of power traveled as a folded sheet, a string, and a seal pressed down with just enough confidence to say, yes, this message is official, without saying anything else at all. Somewhere a quill scratches. Somewhere a candle leans and drips like it's thinking hard. Somewhere a courier adjusts the strap and pretends his bag is not full of other people's priorities. And before we let any of those priorities wander off into the night, where and what time are you listening from? If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the air do that slow, quiet thing where nothing is in a hurry. If you're still awake by the time we reach the thrilling subject of how many seals a clerk could press before his wrist started bargaining with him, you can subscribe. Or don't. I won't take it personally. I'm just a voice drifting through the centuries, and the centuries are not great at reading subscriber counts. Now. Imagine the first moment a letter becomes a dispatch. The difference is mostly mood. A letter is personal. A dispatch is a letter that has been taught to stand up straight. In the early modern world, especially across the Holy Roman Empire and all the overlapping territories that loved paperwork as much as they loved titles, messages had to look correct to be trusted. Not because people were naturally trusting. People have never been naturally trusting, but because the system needed a way to recognize itself. That recognition often began at a desk, a wooden surface rubbed smooth by elbows, ink stains, and the gentle despair of repetition. The clerk dips the quill. He breathes. He writes the date in a careful hand, because time is part of authority. Then he chooses words that are meant to survive travel, weather, and the possibility that someone will read them with suspicious eyebrows. Even the materials are quietly political. Paper quality mattered. Ink quality mattered. If you use thin paper, it could tear, smear, or look cheap, which is a dangerous thing for an empire that was constantly trying to look expensive. But thick paper was heavier and weight was money, because couriers were not powered by optimism. So a lot of administration lived in this tiny tension, the desire to appear serious, and the desire to keep the delivery price from becoming a tragedy. It's a very old version of trying to attach a large file to an email and being told politely that you have exceeded the limit. Except back then, the limit was a horse. Once the writing was done, the message had to be made into an object that could travel without being casually improved along the way. That's where wax enters like a sleepy little villain, soft, warm, obedient, and surprisingly dramatic when it hardens. Sealing wax is one of those substances that looks romantic in movies and feels practical in real life, the way a nice fountain pen looks poetic until you have to clean it. The wax would be warmed over a flame, not too close, because scorched wax smells like disappointment, and then dripped onto a folded flap or a tied string. Then the seal, often a signet ring or a carved stamp, would press down, leaving a mark that was both identity and warning. The message says, "If you break this, everyone will know." It's the original tamper-evident packaging, but with more symbolism and less plastic, and there were little rules inside those little rituals. Some seals were personal, some institutional. Some were big and theatrical, meant to impress. Others were small and efficient, meant to survive a journey without cracking like a dry cookie. A seal could carry a coat of arms, initials, a saint, an eagle, a lion that looked mildly irritated, or a combination of all of the above. The fun part is that the symbols often had the same practical function as a modern logo: instant recognition, and a gentle suggestion that arguing with the sender is a waste of time. You might not expect branding to be medieval, but medieval people were, if anything, extremely into being recognized. Now, the courier becomes part of the story, quietly, like a shadow in a doorway. Postal systems weren't always a single unified government service the way many people imagine today. They could be a patchwork of privileges, routes, contracts, and families. One of the most famous names in European postal history is Taxis, a family that operated postal services across large parts of the Holy Roman Empire for a long time. And that arrangement, private enterprise performing a public function under imperial authority, has a sleepy familiarity. It's like discovering that the official system is held together by subcontractors, invoices, and someone who has a very good stamp collection. Asterisk routes had to be planned. And planning, as you know, is where excitement goes to lie down. How far can a rider go in a day without turning into a complaint? Where do you change horses? Which roads are possible when the weather decides to participate? Where are the inns that will accept a tired courier who smells like leather and urgency? These are not the questions that make epic poems, but they make empires. Every stop along a route was a small hinge in the larger door of communication. The system worked not because everyone was brilliant, but because everyone was predictable. A predictable innkeeper, a predictable horse, a predictable clerk waiting with a ledger, ready to write down that a bag arrived, and then to pretend that writing it down was the same as controlling it. Those ledgers were their own universe. Imagine columns, lines, names, dates, fees. The handwriting changes from town to town like accents. Sometimes the ink is darker, sometimes paler, depending on supplies and mood. There are notes about delays, missing items, rerouted packets. It's the kind of documentation that makes historians feel joy and makes everyone else feel gently sleepy. And there's a dry comedy in how much effort goes into recording the movement of paper. Paper being tracked by more paper, like a snake politely eating its own tail. Now, let's drift into the part where the system tries to be fair, which is always charming. Costs and postage could depend on distance, weight, and sometimes the level of service: ordinary, express, diplomatic, courier only. And because people have always loved loopholes the way cats love warm spots, there were constant attempts to avoid fees. Letters could be folded in clever ways. They could be made lighter. They could be passed through friends, officials, or anyone with a privilege that made them franked, meaning they could send post without paying like ordinary mortals. This is the ancient ancestor of using your friend's streaming account because they have the family plan. The empire might be vast, but human behavior is extremely consistent. And then there's the quiet problem of privacy. Seals help, but seals can be broken. Bags can be opened. Couriers can be bribed, threatened, or simply curious. So diplomatic correspondents sometimes use ciphers codes that turned ordinary words into patterns meant to confuse anyone who wasn't invited. Ciphers sound exciting, but in practice they can be wonderfully tedious. Tables, substitutions, repeated symbols, pages of instructions. Imagine being a sleepy clerk tasked with decoding a message, one symbol at a time, while the candle tries to drip directly onto your work. It's less spy thriller, more stubborn puzzle in dim light. And if you make one mistake, you don't get a dramatic explosion. You get a confused reply letter 3 weeks later asking what you meant. By now, the message has been written, sealed, logged, priced, and handed over. It travels. It bumps. It gets warm in the sun, cold in the rain. It sits in a bag next to other messages, all of them convinced they are the most important. Some are, in fact, very important. Some are about taxes. Some are about borders. Some are about appointments. Some are simply someone asking for money in a tone that suggests it is not really a request. It's a gentle comfort to remember that even in grand empires, a lot of communication is basically, please send the thing, or why haven't you sent the thing, or we have sent the thing. Stop asking. And then comes the soft chaos of arrival. A courier reaches a post station, the bag is transferred, and someone checks the seals on the outer pouches. Bags could also be sealed, because even the container needs to prove it is itself. The next rider takes it onward, or a local messenger carries the letter through a town to the recipient's building, where another small ritual happens. The seal is examined, the string is cut, the wax is cracked. There's a tiny violence in it, but a controlled one, the way you snap a chocolate bar. The letter opens like a small mouth, releasing words that have been traveling quietly, staying politely silent until this exact moment. Sometimes the letter doesn't arrive neatly. Sometimes it arrives late. Weather, bandits, bad roads, illness, a horse that decides it has opinions. Delays become their own kind of rhythm in old correspondence. You can see people apologizing for lateness in letters that are themselves late, which is a very human loop. Forgive me for the delay, they write, while the delay continues to spread behind them like a shadow. And sometimes you can see the administrative anxiety, a command that must be followed, but arrives after the moment it was meant for. Like a reminder notification that pops up after you've already missed the meeting. History is full of missed meetings. It's one of its most stable features. In some places, postal services were also social spaces. Post stations weren't just mechanical transfer points. They were places where news drifted. Couriers talked. Innkeepers listened. Locals asked questions in the casual way people ask about weather, because information was a kind of entertainment. When the mail came through, the world felt a little larger. It's like refreshing a feed, except the feed arrives on horseback and sometimes smells faintly of hay. And the irony is that official systems often carried unofficial consequences, gossip, rumor, and that timeless habit of reading other people's urgency as a form of public theater. Now, let's slide gently into the part nobody thinks, which is the staff who keep the system tidy. Someone sorts, someone stacks, someone counts, someone ties bundles with twine that has been handled so much it feels like it has its own memory. There are categories, priorities, markings. This is where bureaucracy becomes not an insult but a physical job. Hands, fingers, paper cuts. The occasional ink blot that turns a number into a philosophical question. And the soft humor here is that the Empire's voice is produced by tired wrists. The grand declarations, the polite threats, the solemn decrees, so many of them begin as a clerk trying to keep his handwriting consistent. And because this is an empire, there's also the special category of letters that are too important to be treated like ordinary mail. Diplomatic packets might be carried by special couriers. Military dispatches might ride faster. Sometimes there were escort arrangements. Sometimes the security was simply the assumption that nobody would dare interfere with something. sealed by the right authority. That assumption was occasionally correct and occasionally very optimistic. The world has always been full of people who are not impressed by seals. What's fascinating, in a sleepy way, is how much of this is about managing trust at a distance. If you can't be physically present, you send a symbol, a seal, a signature, a formulaic opening line, a particular style of folded paper. These become the language of legitimacy. And legitimacy, like a soft blanket, is mostly woven from repeated patterns. Even the phrasing in official correspondence could be rigid, because rigidity looks like seriousness. The letter says, in effect, I am boring, therefore I am real, which is almost the mission statement of this entire series. As time passes, the letters don't just do their job and vanish. Many end up archived, tied in bundles, stored in chests, filed in rooms that smell like dust and wax and old wood. Archives are where urgency goes to fall asleep. A message that once demanded immediate action becomes a quiet artifact, waiting for someone centuries later to unfold it carefully and squint at the handwriting. And that later person may be a historian. Maybe an archivist will look at the seal and feel a strange intimacy with a long dead hand that pressed it down. It's a tiny fingerprint of authority, preserved not because it was beautiful, but because it was routine. Sometimes you can even see the afterlife of postal systems in the way paper wears. Fold lines soften, edges fray, wax chips. The corners get rounded from being handled, like a well-used card in a deck. And it becomes clear that communication isn't just ideas floating in the air. It's material. It has weight. It has texture. It can be lost in a flood, burned in a fire, eaten by something small and ambitious. A mouse, for instance, does not care about imperial decrees. A mouse cares about paper as a building material, which is the most humbling review an empire can receive. And then, quietly, the systems change. Roots shift. Families lose contracts. States centralize. New administrative models arrive, bringing new stamps, new forms, and fresh reasons to feel faintly annoyed. But the basic rhythm remains: write, seal, send, wait, receive, record, archive. It's a slow pulse that feels almost like breathing. In 4 out 6. The world expands and contracts around the movement of messages. So keep facts in one jar. Desks, quills, wax seals. Ledgers, relay stations, writers, routes. The careful, boring labor that turns distance into something manageable. Keep the softer things in another jar. The quiet trust in symbols. The gentle absurdity of moving paper across continents. The way an empire's greatest strength sometimes looks like a tired clerk making sure the day is written neatly . And if your eyes are getting heavy, you can let them. Let the image be simple: a candle, a seal, a folded letter resting for a moment before it moves again. Let the horse outside shift its weight. Let the ink dry. Let the whole enormous system feel, for once, like something small enough to hold in your mind, just a warm drop of wax, a slow press of a ring, and a message that keeps traveling, even when no one is watching. A hammer ticks on marble somewhere in Rome, not loudly, just with that steady little confidence that stone will eventually agree to change. Wax warms beneath a stylus. A name thins to dust in afternoon light. The city is doing what it often does best, pretending it has always been this way and will always remain this way, and that anything inconvenient is simply a temporary misunderstanding in need of chisels. Before we begin drifting through all of that quiet administrative vanishing, where and what time are you listening from? If the room around you is still, you can let it stay that way. Let your shoulders sink a fraction, as if you've just remembered you don't actually have to hold them up. And if you're still awake in a few minutes, somehow, against all odds, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. Rome has seen far grander vows broken than that, and it managed to keep going with impressive calm. There is a particular kind of power that doesn't shout, it doesn't march. It doesn't even need to win an argument. It simply decides that a person should be removed from the shared memory of the world. The way a clerk removes a smudge by scraping the surface until the page looks clean enough to lie convincingly. The Romans had a phrase we now call Damnatio Memoriae, and even if the exact label is modern and a little tidy, the habit is very old. Someone falls from favor, someone loses the right friends, someone becomes politically radioactive, and suddenly the empire begins a slow, meticulous craft project, turning a human being into an absence. It often starts politely. Not politely in the emotional sense. Rome did not specialize in emotional politeness, but politely in the procedural sense. A decision is made. A vote is taken. A decree is spoken aloud in a room that smells faintly of sweat, wool, and expensive intentions. Hands lift. A formula is recited, and what is actually happening is that a life is being converted into instructions. Not burial, exactly. Subtraction, the cancellation of honors, the stopping of offerings, the removal of portraits, the quiet unhappening of someone who had recently been very much happening. It's as if the Senate is updating a public document and hitting save, except the document is stone, and the save button is a man with a chisel. You can almost feel how satisfying it must have been for the people who loved order. Here's the point where anger becomes paperwork. Clerks copy penalties in tidy lines, so resentment can travel by courier without getting tired. Names are listed. Titles are rescinded. The empire doesn't need to scream. It just needs to file. And if you listen closely, you can hear the soothing rhythm of bureaucracy, ink, sand to dry it, folded paper, tied string, sealed wax. Breathe in 4, out 6. The city learns a new law for pretending it never looked directly at the thing it is now denying. Then the unnaming begins, and this is where the whole system becomes strangely visual, like a museum exhibition curated by someone who is furious, but also very detail-oriented. Triumphal arches lose their plaques. Altars forget their dedications. Milestones shed sponsors the way a bored person sheds commitments, quietly and without eye contact. A name that was once carved deep enough to survive weather now becomes a problem to solve with tools. Stonecutters plug letters with mortar, then plane the face until the text looks innocent again, like a sentence that never meant anything, like a compliment that was never directed at anyone in particular. Sometimes you can still see the surgery. Where removal risks collapse, a neat rectangle is left, silent as policy. It's a blank patch that says, without saying, something used to be here, and that blank patch can feel oddly louder than the surrounding words. The way a missing tooth changes a smile, even when the person insists it's fine. Maps stay the same. The legend changes. Streets rehearse the revision overnight. A statue base stands there like a person who has forgotten what they were about to say, and everyone politely pretends they didn't notice. There's a soft comedy to the empire trying to erase someone in a world that keeps physical receipts. You can't fully delete a person when the city is made of inscriptions. You can only sand, patch, swap, and hope the future doesn't develop curiosity. Rome, unfortunately for Rome, produced a lot of curious future people. Once the decision is made, the next step is craft, tools for making a ghost. This is less dramatic than it sounds. It is mostly someone standing very close to a portrait with a plan, and perhaps a slightly resigned expression. Faces are recut, coins are recalled, portraits are shaved into new emperor's hair, altered, jaw reweighted, eyes taught to be someone else. It's like taking an old photograph and insisting it has always been a different person, except you do it with bronze, and you do it slowly because bronze has no interest in your timeline. If you've ever watched someone try to fix a historical statue by aggressively cleaning it, you'll understand the mood. The original image doesn't disappear. It just gets bullied into a new shape. Bronze heads vanish into furnaces. Silver denarii come home through taxes and never return. A coin can be a tiny billboard, and billboards are dangerous when the person on them is now officially unwelcome. So coins are hoarded, melted, restruck. The economy does a small, sleepy shudder while officials pretend this is normal maintenance. Intaglios are flipped and re-engraved. Signet rings learn new initials without complaint. And the records always sound calmer than the reality. The budget reads repairs. The gallery reads amnesia. The crowd reads whatever is still hanging. It's the most Roman thing in the world. Even revenge must look organized. Even erasure must keep its posture. And then there's paper, wax, and whisper, because stone and bronze are only the loudest surfaces. The softer surfaces are where memory actually lives day to day. Papyrus is scraped and overwritten. Wax tablets are leveled smooth, as if no message ever pressed into them. There's something almost gentle about this part, even though it isn't kind. A wax tablet is erasable by design. It expects forgetting. It was built for it. A stylus scratches, then the flat end smooths. A thought becomes a thought that never happened. Public records strike lines through titles. Private letters switch to pronouns and ellipses. A man who had a name becomes that man. A woman who had a title becomes she, and the she is left floating, conveniently untethered. Chroniclers file events under weather or prodigies, letting names stay off stage. This is the safest kind of writing, vague enough to survive regime change, specific enough to sound like you witnessed something. It's the ancient version of writing an email that says, per our previous conversation, without stating what the conversation was, because you have learned that clarity is not always rewarded. Somewhere, a scribe pauses and considers whether to use the person's full name or just an initial. Somewhere, a different scribe pretends he never even had to consider it. Somewhere, a librarian shifts a scroll to a different shelf, because sometimes erasure is just reorganization. Now the quiet consequences spread outward, the way a dropped pebble spreads, rings across water without ever making a second sound. Collateral silence is not glamorous. It is domestic. Statues and atriums step down. Household gods' lyres accept quieter offerings, because loud devotion can be misinterpreted, and misinterpretation in Rome is a hobby with sharp edges. Family seals are boxed and sealed again. It's very strange, if you think about it, how quickly a family can learn to become careful. Heirs trade cognomina or adopt new patrons, so their signatures can keep earning. Freedmen pick new masters on paper. Old favors are paid in distance, not thanks. Confiscations arrive with receipts because Rome adored receipts. Absence is made legible so it can be enforced. That is one of the most soothingly boring truths of power. If you want a thing to happen reliably, you turn it into a document. And imagine the staff, the household staff who have spent years calling a person dominus or domina, and now must retrain their tongues. A small silence appears in the middle of daily routines. Someone sets down a cup and realizes they are about to gossip, and then remembers that gossip has become a dangerous sport. Someone else stops wearing a particular ring. Someone quietly moves a portrait to a storage room. Not because anyone shouted at them, but because the air itself has changed. Rome can do that, change the air without touching you directly. Out in the provinces, the erasure is slower, like winter arriving late. Governors repaint dedications. Fort gates swap tablets. Legion standards swear to a different face. It must have been oddly annoying in a practical way, like being told your workplace has rebranded and now you need to learn a new slogan, accept the slogan as a human being, and the consequences for forgetting are much more sincere. In remote towns, the old inscription lingers, sun-pitted, almost brave. Someone walks past it every day and doesn't think about it at all, because most people do not wake up thinking about imperial name changes. Merchants whisper two names for prices, what it was, what it is now. Rome pretends change is instant. The provinces prove time has borders. A messenger arrives with instructions, and the local stonecutter squints at the old letters and decides how much effort to spend on removing them. Some towns comply enthusiastically. Some comply lazily. Some comply in a way that suggests they are doing the minimum amount of history required. And of course, there are oaths. Oaths are always easier to say than to maintain. The emperor's name changes on official lips first, then on ordinary lips last, because ordinary lips are busy with ordinary things: bread, rent, weather, arguments, love affairs, sore feet. Erasure, for most people, is a distant policy that becomes real only when it interrupts lunch. Eventually, what remains are the holes. This is the part that feels almost peaceful because a hole is quiet. Reading the holes is a skill, like reading pauses in music. Epigraphers trace letter ghosts. Drill marks confess where laurels used to rest. The surface tells its own story if you stare long enough. The way a worn stair tells you how many feet climbed it without ever writing down a number. A blank on a triumphal list rings louder than any boast written straight. You don't need the missing name to know something happened. You only need the shape of the absence. Coin hoards tell a timeline of faces the furnace missed by a winter. A coin that survives can be a tiny act of disobedience, or just a coin that fell under a floorboard and stayed there, quietly uninterested in politics. History, in this way, is often written by accidents: a collapsed wall, a buried chest, a ship that went down with someone as carefully collected money and no one as carefully collected loyalty. And there's the gentle irony that erasure can preserve. When you remove something, you draw attention to the removal. When you smooth a surface, you leave tool marks. When you censor a name, you create a mystery, and human beings love mysteries the way they love warm beds. They settle into them. Rome wanted to make people forget. Instead, it sometimes taught the future exactly where to look. So as you drift toward the end of this quiet tour, keep facts in one jar. Votes, decrees, chisels, plaster patches, recalled coins, rewritten tablets, provincial repainting, household caution, the slow machinery that turns a person into an administrative problem. Keep rumor in another jar labeled light, revisable, because rumor is always ready to sneak into any gap left by official silence. Assume memory sanctions are power practicing to be delicate, never kind. Not loud, not theatrical, just persistent. Tomorrow, test one silence. Who benefits from the missing name, and who still uses it anyway, softly, like a habit that refuses to be retrained? The hammer cools, the wax hardens, the marble face sleeps under a new jaw, and Rome moves on, as if moving on were the same thing as forgetting, and as if the city has never once paused to listen to the sound of its own erasures settling into dust.